we would never know whether the degree of connection between us would have been the same had you omitted that story from your presentation. I mean, it was certainly a catalyst to a deep bonding between us.
Why knowledge matters. Yeah, wonderful, Andrea. So lovely that you also found time. I'm very impressed, and I'm very grateful to Vern that he made this happen. And yeah, hopefully, as he said, I think there are hopefully many follow-ups that we can, continue and pursue, like many different, projects will come out. I'm sure.
I definitely feel that actually the thanks is to you, because Vern and I go a long way back, and we had this story in common. I think that what you added is this extraordinary possibility of doing something with it that is unusual, that is very creative. So I'm more excited and very grateful.
The story of Dirk is recorded in this book called Martyr's Mirror, which was originally written in Dutch and translated into English. And it has many examples of martyrdom that go back to the early centuries of the church, long before there were any Anabaptists, but the bulk of it tells the story of Anabaptist martyrs. And on page 741, we have a picture of Dirk Willems turning around and helping the person that fell through the ice and was pursuing him, helping him up. So these line drawings make a lot of the stories really come alive, and that's the source of most of the information that we have about Dirk.
It's good probably for me to start, because it was a surprise for both of us, but I think that in many ways I broke the ice by mentioning Dirk Willems in a lecture that I was doing at St. Paul University. And I don't remember if that was my first time at St. Paul, but I would imagine that it was. It was a prestigious lecture, Macher's lecture. I was chosen by a selected committee, and I was giving this lecture. And it was in a very important moment of my career. Was the way I say this sometimes is that I was a gift of Mozambique to the US. I was sent by the community of Sant'Egidio to New York to follow the peace process of Mozambique. And while in New York and needing to find a way to survive, I started professionally a center at Columbia University, the Center for International Conflict Resolution, and became interested in not only doing conflict resolution with the community of Sant'Egidio, Mozambique, Algeria, and many other places, but also thinking about conflict resolution, trying to understand conflict resolution, trying to explain it, and so on. So when I did the lecture, I was at the beginning of an exposure to Bernard Lonergan and the friendship with Ken Melchin and the group that then later gave birth to the Inside approach and so on. But the issue that I felt was very important in front of us was this issue of learning from the past in creative ways. I'm Catholic, I'm a devout Catholic, and studying past experiences of occasions in which Catholic had killed other Christians, I came across the story of Dirk Willems. And I was touched by the story itself, but also by the tradition, the Anabaptist tradition of remembering Dirk, not as a way to invite children to take revenge on Catholic, to be violent against Catholic, to get even with Catholic and so on, but rather to learn from Dirk the virtue of life-giving sacrifice. And so I was deeply touched by the story itself and by the 400 years old, 500 years old tradition, a Baptist tradition of remembering it regularly in family settings and so on. So in the middle of the lecture, I'm making this point of the responsibility of remembering and the responsibility of reconstructing the past as a liberating force for energies and possibilities that we are not considering because we are stuck into the conflict, especially the violent one, where we are defined by the interests and forces and power structures and so on and so forth. And so I mentioned Dirk with great appreciation, with great surprise and so on and so forth. Little did I know that Vern was a Mennonite, and he heard the story obviously as a young kid. Now the story is yours.
Okay, so from my perspective, I had been hired by St. Paul University to lead the development of a conflict studies program. I had done my PhD in the Faculty of Theology and was now a lone Mennonite working for the for a Catholic institution. And one of my professors had been Ken Melchin, who now was a colleague, and he thought that I'd really like Andreas for some reason, and he thought Andreas would be a great person to present a Glasmacher lecture, and so he and I made a joint application to the university to have Andreas give the lecture. So it fell to me to chair the meeting. And so I introduced Andreas, and in the middle of his lecture, he told this story about somebody who was different. And because he was different, he was persecuted. The community turned on him. And then as he told the story of this person who was different and persecuted, how he was running away and got over the ice, and the person trying to apprehend him fell through the ice, Dirk went back and helped him out. And as soon as I heard that, I figured, oh, I know where this story comes from. And it blew me away that somebody who was a Catholic would talk about, first of all, tell the story about Dirk, because the Catholics do not come out well in the story, and hold him up as a positive example, and say that we should be learning together about this. And I figured, wow, this is really something, because as a tiny minority group, which the Mennonites are, there's not a whole lot of positive recognition from other Christian groups. And so I was deeply moved to have this happen. And so when it was over, I identified myself as a Mennonite and told them how much it meant, and the two of us spontaneously embraced on stage. And so it was a sort of a profound symbolic action of Mennonite Roman Catholic reconciliation on the micro level through this example of Dirk Willems. So as I think it's really important that all of us, in whatever tradition, have a capacity for self-critical reflection. And Andreas demonstrated that capacity by looking at his own tradition through the lens of what happened to Dirk and thousands of other Anabaptists who were killed during the time of the Reformation. And I think likewise it falls to us as Mennonites, Anabaptists, to look at our own tradition critically, or at least take a step back enough to say, can we understand some of the things that were pushing that kind of persecution? So if you think about it, the Anabaptists made a number of truth claims based on their understanding of the New Testament. One of these truth claims was that people are responsible themselves for their own belief, position, and their relationship with God. There's nothing magical from the outside that can change that, and it's the person's own interior orientation and transformation that becomes important. And the corollary of that understanding was that adults are the ones who should be baptized. Baptism should happen as a result of a recognition of this inner transformation. And to baptize children doesn't leave the openness for them to decide for themselves. A second key part of this is that their reading of the Sermon on the Mount, taking the verses quite literally about loving their enemies, meant that one couldn't go out and be vengeful and harm one's enemies, which meant that for someone who was following Jesus, and for Mennonites, Nachfolge, the following after Jesus, was really important. You couldn't do that and go killing your enemies, which meant that you really couldn't be part of the armed forces. A third thing that emerged out of their understanding of the New Testament that was radical at the time was that there should be a separation of church and state. And so leading up to the Reformation, we had the concept in the church, and it was one church, of Corpus Christianum, the body of Christ, that the whole population was the body of Christ together. And so this body of Christ, this Corpus Christianum, was jointly led by the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in Central Europe, and by the bishops and church leaders, and ultimately the Pope. And the Pope was involved in the coronation of the emperor and so on. So these three ideas were a core threat to the existence of the church-state structure that existed at the time. I don't think the Catholics had thought it through that time, but at a visceral level, they said, here are people advocating things that if these beliefs became widely accepted, it would lead to the unraveling of the system that they had. And I don't think that people from my tradition have always acknowledged the degree to what they were propounding was indeed a very deep threat to what was going on.
So let me continue on my side. That what touched me about the story was also that the person that was saved by Dirk wanted him to be saved, right? The guard that was saved, and that several of the people around that understood the episode and so on actually wanted him to be alive. And it was the authority, exactly in this link of religious power and secular power that Vern was describing, that forced the execution, and not only an execution, but an execution through burning that lasted for 2 days. It was a very painful one, was a terrible thing, was a public things and so on. And I think it's important to realize that as a Catholic, I'm very used to articulation, right? Many people that are not Catholic fail to see how different Catholics are within. So you have St. Francis that goes to speak with the Muslim leader, and in the middle of the Crusades is calling for peace and conversions and so on. But of course, you have a lot of crusaders that are killing others and so on and so forth. So Christianity on the Catholic side has been always very articulated, and Sant'Egidio is part of this articulation. It's a post-Vatican II, very ecumenical, very open, very diverse, as Vern was noticing. So what I was noticing is that in Dirk's story, this articulation is almost spontaneous. That is the story itself that is in a way inviting everyone to decide where do you stand, where are you? And this reminded me of a beautiful expression of a very famous Italian priest, Lorenzo Milani, a Jewish origin, original priest of Florence that was priest when we were growing up, and was always calling for this logic of responsibility, the faith as a social responsibility and so on. So I felt immediately that as a Catholic, it was important for me to remember the story. And after the embrace with Vern, even more, that this was actually something that I had to do in a public forum, right? That he and I were meant to be saying the story together, that the story told by an Anabaptist and a Catholic together after Vatican II, after so much change in Christianity, after so much change globally and so on and so forth, after so much change in the human understanding of violence, in the human understanding of power, in the human understanding of power structures and states and so on and so forth, that this could be a conversation that could be very liberating for a lot of people, certainly within Christianity, but probably beyond Christianity. Insofar, we are inviting everybody to be reflective, to be open to what the Spirit is saying, and so on and so forth. I think we are starting something very important.
Yeah, and we would never know whether the degree of connection between us would have been the same had you omitted that story from your presentation. I mean, it was certainly a catalyst to a deep bonding between us, and what that bonding between us did is it led to a number of follow-up kinds of activities, including a few years later when you became dean at George Mason University, inviting me to provide a guest presentation there, and that had its own spin-off effects, including an encounter with you and other editors, authors around the whole subject of going from practice to theory rather than theory to practice, and a number of things like that. And then later on, you being involved in integrative peace building, and that is its own story as well.
That's why knowledge matters.